In 1839, Britain went to war with China. Not because China attacked British territory, not because of a border dispute or political disagreement. Britain invaded China because the Chinese government tried to stop British merchants from selling opium to Chinese citizens. Read that again. Britain fought a war to force China to accept drug imports that were destroying Chinese society. And Britain won. Twice. The Opium Wars are rarely taught in Western schools, and when they are, they're sanitized as trade disputes or conflicts over sovereignty. But the truth is simpler and darker. Britain deliberately turned millions of Chinese into opium addicts to balance trade deficits, then used military force to protect that drug trade when China tried to stop it. This wasn't rogue merchants or criminal enterprises. This was official British policy, backed by the Royal Navy, justified by Parliament, and celebrated as a triumph of free trade. It was state-sponsored drug trafficking on a scale never seen before or since, and the wealth it generated helped build the British Empire while destroying an entire civilization. This is the story of how one empire used addiction as a weapon of economic warfare, and why the playbook Britain pioneered is still being used today. In the 18th century, Britain had a China problem. The British were obsessed with Chinese goods: tea, silk, porcelain. Demand was enormous. British aristocrats would pay fortunes for Chinese tea. The middle classes wanted Chinese silk. Everyone wanted Chinese porcelain. But China didn't want anything Britain produced. The Chinese had their own tea, their own silk, their own everything. British wool, manufactured goods, and other exports held no appeal. Chinese emperors viewed European products as inferior barbarian crafts. This created a massive trade imbalance. Britain paid for Chinese goods with silver, tons of it. Year after year, British silver flowed into China, while Chinese goods flowed to Britain. The drain was unsustainable. The British East India Company, which controlled British trade with Asia, needed a solution. They needed something Chinese people would buy in quantities large enough to reverse the silver drain. They found it in India, in the opium poppy fields of Bengal. Opium had been used in China for centuries, primarily for medicinal purposes. But consumption was limited. The East India Company saw an opportunity. They controlled vast territories in India, where opium was grown. If they could create mass demand for opium in China, they could balance the trade deficit. So they began shipping Indian opium to China. Not openly, because opium was illegal in China. The Qing dynasty had banned it in 1729, recognizing its addictive properties and social dangers. But the East India Company didn't care about Chinese law. They smuggled the opium through private merchants who sold it to Chinese dealers. And the strategy worked. Opium addiction spread, first among the wealthy and elite, then filtering down through society. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted. The silver drain reversed. Now Chinese silver flowed to British merchants to buy opium, while British pounds bought Chinese tea. Britain had solved its trade problem by turning China into a nation of addicts. By the 1830s, the opium trade had become catastrophic for China. Estimates suggest 10 to 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium, roughly 10% of the adult male population. In some regions, the addiction rate was even higher. This wasn't recreational use. Opium addiction is physically devastating. Addicts became emaciated, unable to work, consumed by the need for the next dose. Families were destroyed as wage earners spent everything on opium. Crime exploded as addicts stole to fund their habits. The economic damage was enormous. Silver was flowing out of China to pay for opium at a rate that dwarfed the earlier tea trade imbalance. The Chinese economy was hemorrhaging wealth to feed a foreign-induced addiction epidemic. The social fabric was tearing apart. Government officials were addicted. Soldiers were addicted. Even some members of the imperial court were addicted. Corruption was rampant as officials took bribes to ignore smuggling. The Qing dynasty was losing control. And the British response? Increase shipments. By 1838, the East India Company and private British merchants were shipping over 40,000 chests of opium annually to China. Each chest contained about 140 pounds of opium. That's roughly 5.6 million pounds of opium per year flooding into China. The profits were staggering. Opium became the East India Company's most profitable export. The taxes and revenues from the opium trade funded the British administration in India and contributed significantly to the British treasury. British merchants knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't blind to the devastation. Reports from China describe the addiction epidemic in detail. But profit trumped morality. As long as Chinese addicts kept buying, British merchants kept selling. This was deliberate policy. The British government knew opium was illegal in China. They knew it was destroying Chinese society. They didn't care. The trade was too profitable, and Britain's economic interests took priority over Chinese lives. In 1839, the Qing dynasty decided to act. Emperor Daoguang appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu to end the opium trade. Lin was a reformer, incorruptible and determined. He arrived in Canton, the center of foreign trade, with a mission: stop the opium smuggling. Lin wrote to Queen Victoria directly, appealing to morality. He asked how Britain could justify selling to China a product that was illegal in Britain itself. He pointed out that opium destroyed lives and societies. He demanded the trade stop. The letter went unanswered. Britain had no intention of stopping. So Lin took direct action. He demanded that foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks. When they refused, he blockaded the foreign trading compound, trapping British merchants inside until they complied. The British eventually surrendered over 20,000 chests of opium, worth millions of pounds. Lin had the opium destroyed publicly, mixed with lime and salt, and flushed into the sea. It took 23 days to destroy it all. Lin then demanded that British merchants sign pledges never to trade opium again, under penalty of death. Some signed, others refused and left China. From China's perspective, this was law enforcement, a sovereign nation enforcing its laws against illegal drug smuggling. Lin was a hero, defending China against foreign poison. From Britain's perspective, this was an act of aggression. British property had been destroyed. British merchants had been threatened. And most importantly, British economic interests had been attacked. The British government had a choice: accept China's right to enforce its own laws, or use military force to protect the opium trade. They chose war. In 1840, Britain sent a naval expedition to China. 48 warships, 4,000 Marines, and modern artillery against a Chinese military that was decades behind in technology. The British claimed they were fighting for free trade and to protect their citizens from Chinese aggression. In reality, they were fighting to force China to accept opium imports. The war was a massacre. British steam-powered gunboats destroyed Chinese war junks. British artillery shelled coastal cities. Chinese forces, armed with outdated weapons and tactics, couldn't compete. The Qing dynasty tried to negotiate. They offered concessions on trade, on foreign access to ports. But the British demanded more: reparations for the destroyed opium, compensation for the costs of the war, and continued access to Chinese markets for opium. In 1842, China surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking was signed, the first of what China would call the unequal treaties. Under its terms, China paid 21 million silver dollars in reparations, partially to compensate for the destroyed opium. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 Chinese ports were open to British trade, and British merchants gained extraterritorial rights, meaning they couldn't be tried under Chinese law. The treaty didn't explicitly legalize opium, but it removed barriers to its trade. British merchants could now operate more freely, and opium shipments increased. Britain had fought a war to protect drug dealers and won. And the precedent was set. European powers could impose their will on China through military force. The Treaty of Nanking didn't end the conflict. British merchants wanted more access. The opium trade continued to grow, and China's efforts to resist were met with more force. In 1856, Britain used a minor incident, the seizure of a Hong Kong-registered ship by Chinese authorities, as a pretext for a second war. France joined, seeking its own concessions. Together, they launched an invasion. The Second Opium War was even more brutal. British and French forces marched on Beijing. They sacked the Old Summer Palace, one of China's greatest cultural treasures, looting priceless artifacts and burning the complex to the ground. The destruction was deliberate, a message that resistance would be met with cultural annihilation. The British commander, Lord Elgin, justified it as punishment for Chinese resistance. In 1860, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Tientsin. The terms were even harsher. Opium was explicitly legalized. China had to formally accept British opium imports. More ports were open to foreign trade. Christian missionaries were given the right to proselytize freely in China. China paid enormous reparations to Britain and France. Foreign diplomats were granted the right to reside in Beijing, ensuring constant European presence and pressure. Britain had won again. The opium trade was not only protected, but officially sanctioned. China was forced to accept the drug that was destroying its society. The Opium Wars began what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation, a period from 1839 to 1949, when China was dominated, carved up, and exploited by foreign powers. After Britain's victories, other nations demanded similar concessions. France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the United States all extracted treaties, territory, and economic privileges. China's sovereignty was shredded. The opium epidemic worsened. By the early 20th century, an estimated 25% of Chinese men were addicted to opium. Entire regions were economically paralyzed. The Qing dynasty, weakened by addiction, corruption, and foreign domination, collapsed in 1911. The social damage was incalculable. Families destroyed, productivity collapsed, an entire generation lost to addiction. The wealth that should have built Chinese infrastructure and industry instead flowed to British merchants and the British treasury. Britain justified this as free trade, as opening backward nations to commerce and civilization. But the reality was brutal exploitation. Britain had used military force to create and protect a drug trade that devastated China for over a century. And the profits? They helped finance British infrastructure, industry, and empire. The railroads, factories, and institutions built in Victorian Britain were funded in part by opium money extracted from Chinese addicts. The moral calculus was clear. Chinese lives didn't matter as much as British profits. The Opium Wars ended over 150 years ago. But the playbook Britain used, create addiction, profit from it, use power to protect the trade, has been replicated by modern pharmaceutical companies. Consider the opioid epidemic in the United States. Pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma marketed drugs like OxyContin as safe and non-addictive, despite knowing they were highly addictive. They incentivized doctors to prescribe them. They downplayed risks and pushed for wider use. The result was an addiction epidemic. Over 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses since 1999. Families destroyed, communities devastated, and pharmaceutical companies profited enormously, making billions while the crisis grew. When regulators and prosecutors tried to stop them, pharmaceutical companies used legal teams, lobbying, and political influence to protect their profits. They didn't send gunboats, but they used lawsuits, campaign donations, and regulatory capture to achieve the same goal: protect the drug trade. The parallels are striking. Create addiction through aggressive marketing. Profit from the addiction. Use power and influence to prevent regulation or accountability. And when the damage becomes undeniable, pay small fines while keeping the profits and continuing operations. Purdue Pharma eventually declared bankruptcy and settled for billions in fines. But the Sackler family, who owned the company, kept most of their fortune. No one went to prison. The system that enabled the epidemic, pharmaceutical marketing, regulatory capture, political influence, remains intact. This is the legacy of the Opium Wars. The methods change, the scale varies, but the fundamental pattern, using addiction for profit and power to protect it, continues. In 1839, Britain went to war to force China to accept drug imports. They won, twice. Millions of Chinese became addicted. An entire civilization was weakened and exploited, and the profits helped build the British Empire. The Opium Wars aren't taught as drug wars. They're sanitized as trade conflicts, as clashes of civilizations, as unfortunate but necessary steps in opening China to the world. But the truth is simpler. Britain deliberately turned millions into addicts for profit and used military force to protect that trade. That playbook never disappeared. It was refined, modernized, and replicated. Pharmaceutical companies used it in the opioid epidemic. The tactics evolved, but the strategy remained: create dependency, maximize profit, and use power to prevent accountability. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. The Opium Wars weren't ancient history. They were the blueprint for using addiction as a weapon of economic warfare, and that blueprint is still in use today. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.